There are some cases that refuse to fade from public memory, no matter how many years pass, not because they remain unsolved, but because of the questions they leave behind. Questions that linger long after headlines disappear, long after investigators move on, and long after communities try to heal. The Delphi murders are one of those cases. If you followed this story, you probably remember exactly where your attention was first captured. Maybe it was the haunting image of a man walking across an abandoned railroad bridge. Maybe it was the few chilling words recorded on a teenage girl's cell phone. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that two young friends vanished during what should have been an ordinary afternoon walk. Years later, the details remain as unsettling as ever. Not because we don't know what happened to Abby Williams and Libby German that day, but because we know just enough to understand how quickly an ordinary afternoon turned into one of the most disturbing crimes in modern American history. What makes this case so difficult to revisit isn't only the tragedy itself. It's the realization that nearly every decision made that afternoon seemed completely routine. There were no obvious warning signs, no indication that danger was waiting just ahead. Just two girls enjoying a day off from school, laughing together, taking pictures, and walking across one of Delphi's best-known landmarks. Looking back now, knowing how the story ends, every photograph, every timestamp, and every decision carries a weight it never had before. February 13th, 2017, began like any other winter day in Delphi, Indiana. Delphi is a small city in Carroll County, home to only a few thousand residents. It is the kind of place where people recognize familiar faces at the grocery store, where neighbors wave to one another from their front porches, and where serious crime is relatively uncommon. For many families, it represented exactly the kind of close-knit community where children could still enjoy a degree of independence that might seem unusual in larger cities. The Monon High Bridge Trail reflected that same character. Originally part of the historic Monon Railroad, the bridge had long since fallen out of use. Rising roughly 70 feet above Deer Creek and stretching more than 800 feet across the valley, the weathered railroad bridge had become one of Delphi's most recognizable landmarks. Visitors came to hike the surrounding trails, admire the scenery, and, for those willing to cross the aging wooden railroad ties, experience a breathtaking view that was equal parts beautiful and intimidating. Crossing the bridge required careful footing. The wooden ties were unevenly spaced with visible gaps between them. There were no handrails. Every step demanded attention. For local teenagers, though, the bridge had become something of a rite of passage. Among those familiar with the area were two best friends, Abigail Abby Williams and Liberty Libby German. At just 13 years old, Abby was known for her quiet, gentle personality. Friends and family often described her as kind, thoughtful, and mature beyond her years. She loved reading, drawing, and spending time outdoors. Those who knew her remembered a girl who rarely sought the spotlight but whose calm nature made people feel comfortable around her. Libby, 14 years old, possessed an entirely different energy. Outgoing, curious, and adventurous, she had a natural enthusiasm that often drew others in. She enjoyed photography, sports, and trying new things. Family members frequently spoke about her sense of humor and confidence. She wasn't afraid to ask questions or take initiative, qualities that would later prove remarkably significant. Despite their different personalities, the two girls shared a close friendship. They complemented one another in ways that often define lifelong friends. Abby's quiet steadiness balanced Libby's adventurous spirit, and together they spent countless hours talking, exploring, and making memories in their hometown. Neither girl had any reason to believe that Monday would be remembered around the world. Schools in Delphi had closed for the day because unused snow days had been built into the school calendar. With an unexpected day off and mild February weather, many local residents took advantage of the opportunity to spend time outside. The temperature had climbed well above freezing, making it feel unusually pleasant for mid-February in Indiana. It was the sort of afternoon that encouraged people to leave their homes after weeks of winter weather. Libby and Abby decided they wanted to visit the Monon High Bridge. The plan wasn't unusual. Teenagers and families frequently visited the trail system, especially when the weather cooperated. It was familiar territory, and neither their families nor the girls themselves viewed the outing as particularly risky. That morning unfolded much like any other day off from school. Abby had spent the night at Libby's home. Sleepovers between the friends were nothing out of the ordinary, and they were looking forward to spending another day together before returning to school. Transportation became the only real logistical question. Eventually, arrangements were made for Libby's older sister, Kelsey German, to drive the girls to the trailhead. Around 1:35 p.m., Kelsey dropped Abby and Libby off near the entrance to the Monon High Bridge Trail. Before leaving, she watched them begin walking toward the trails. It was a brief goodbye. There was every expectation that she would see them again in just a couple of hours. Plans had already been made for Libby's father, Derek German, to pick them up later that afternoon. The arrangement was simple. The girls would explore the trails, enjoy the warm weather, and be collected at approximately 3:15 p.m. Nothing about the schedule suggested concern. Nothing about the afternoon appeared out of place. As the girls walked deeper into the trail system, they did what countless teenagers do when spending time together. They talked, they laughed, they took photographs. One of those photographs would eventually become one of the final confirmed images taken before everything changed. At 2:07 p.m., Libby posted a photograph to Snapchat showing Abby walking across the Monon High Bridge. The image has since become instantly recognizable to millions of people around the world. In the photograph, Abby is seen carefully navigating the old railroad ties while wearing a burgundy sweatshirt and jeans. Behind her stretches the weathered bridge, suspended high above Deer Creek. At the time, it was simply a snapshot between friends. Today, it stands as one of the last publicly known moments in which Abby was alive. Looking at the photograph now, it's impossible not to notice its ordinary nature. There is no visible fear, no indication of panic, no sign that anything is wrong. It captures exactly what it appears to be: two teenagers enjoying an afternoon adventure together. That sense of normalcy is precisely what makes the image so heartbreaking. The Monon High Bridge itself presents a unique environment. Because of its length and height, crossing it is not something most people do casually. Every step requires concentration. The uneven wooden railroad ties leave gaps that expose the ground far below. Many first-time visitors move cautiously, carefully placing each foot before taking another step. Experienced visitors often cross more confidently, but even they remain aware of the bridge's challenges. Once someone commits to walking across, turning around isn't always the easiest option. The bridge naturally narrows a person's choices of movement. That reality has become an important part of nearly every discussion surrounding the case, though many questions about exactly what happened remain unanswered. As the afternoon continued, the girls moved farther along the trail system beyond the bridge. Publicly available information establishes certain points in the timeline with confidence. We know they arrived shortly after 1:35 p.m. We know Libby's Snapchat photograph of Abby was posted at 2:07 p.m. We also know that at some point afterward, Libby's cell phone captured evidence that would become central to one of the largest homicide investigations in Indiana history. But at that moment, none of that had happened yet. To everyone outside the trail system, Abby and Libby were simply enjoying a day off from school. Back at home, family members continued with their afternoons, expecting nothing more complicated than an ordinary pickup. No emergency calls had been made. No one was searching the trails. No one imagined that, within hours, hundreds of volunteers would begin combing the woods surrounding Deer Creek. As the afternoon quietly moved forward, the ordinary routine that had begun with a simple ride to the trail was approaching a turning point that no one could have anticipated. For the families, time was still passing normally. For Abby and Libby, however, something had already begun to unfold beyond the view of everyone who loved them. The afternoon was slipping away, and with it, the last moments in which everything still seemed normal. Before long, the first signs that something was terribly wrong would begin to emerge, not through a dramatic phone call or a witness rushing for help, but through something far more unsettling. Two girls who were always expected to be exactly where they said they would be simply failed to arrive. By the standards of most missing person cases, the first indication that something was wrong seemed almost insignificant. A missed pickup. It was the kind of thing that happens every day. A dead phone battery, losing track of time, taking a different trail back. Any number of ordinary explanations could account for two teenagers being a few minutes late. That was exactly what their families hoped had happened. As planned, Libby's father, Derek German, arrived at the Monon High Bridge trail around 3:15 p.m. to pick up the girls. The arrangement had been simple. Abby and Libby would spend a couple of hours exploring the trails before meeting him at the designated location. When he got there, they weren't waiting. At first, there was no reason to panic. Derek called Libby's cell phone, expecting to hear it ring or receive an answer explaining that they were on their way. There was no response. He looked around the immediate area, believing they might have taken a different path back toward the trailhead. The Monon High Bridge trail wasn't enormous, but it contained several routes, wooded sections, and uneven terrain. It wasn't difficult to imagine the girls simply being delayed. Minutes passed. The phone still wasn't answered. The optimism that had accompanied those first few calls slowly began giving way to concern. Derek searched the nearby trails himself, calling out their names and hoping to hear familiar voices answer from somewhere in the woods. Nothing. As more time passed, other family members arrived to help. What had started as one person looking for two teenagers quickly became a coordinated effort involving relatives, friends, and anyone nearby willing to assist. Everyone worked from the same assumption. The girls had to be somewhere. Perhaps they had wandered farther down the trail than expected. Perhaps they had slipped on uneven ground and needed help getting back. Perhaps they had encountered a problem with their phones. Every possibility seemed more likely than the alternative. As the afternoon turned toward evening, the search expanded. Family members checked parking areas to see if anyone had noticed Abby and Libby leaving. They walked the trails repeatedly, calling their names, hoping to hear a response echo through the trees. The weather, pleasant only hours earlier, began changing with the approach of sunset. Temperatures started falling. Daylight slowly disappeared. The urgency increased. Eventually, local law enforcement became involved. Officers from the Delphi Police Department, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office, and other emergency personnel began organizing a larger search effort. Volunteers from the community answered the call almost immediately. Delphi was the kind of town where people showed up. Neighbors left their homes. Friends interrupted their evening plans. People who had never met Abby or Libby still joined the search simply because two local girls were missing. Searchers spread across trails, fields, wooded areas, and creek banks, using flashlights as darkness settled over Carroll County. The Monon High Bridge and the surrounding landscape presented unique challenges. Dense vegetation, steep embankments, and the winding path of Deer Creek created countless places where someone might become injured or difficult to locate. Searchers carefully examined areas near the bridge, believing the girls might have fallen or become stranded. At that point, investigators were still treating the situation primarily as a missing persons case. There was no confirmed evidence suggesting foul play. The focus remained on finding Abby and Libby alive. Throughout the evening, officers continued trying to establish exactly where the girls had been seen. Witnesses were interviewed. Possible sightings were discussed. Investigators worked to build a timeline from the moment Kelsey German had dropped them off until Derek German arrived for pickup. Every minute mattered. Every new piece of information was evaluated in hopes that it might reveal where the girls had gone. Meanwhile, family members endured one of the longest nights imaginable. Waiting, hoping, refusing to accept the possibility that something terrible had happened. As darkness deepened, the search became increasingly difficult. Navigating the trails at night required caution. The abandoned railroad bridge itself was hazardous even during daylight. Crossing it after sunset, with only flashlights illuminating the weathered railroad ties, carried obvious risks. Search teams continued anyway. Nobody wanted to leave the girls alone overnight if there was any chance they were injured and waiting for help. Hours passed with no sign of them. Eventually, after extensive searching through the night, authorities suspended the organized search until daylight. It was a painful decision. The terrain had become too dangerous to search effectively in complete darkness, and additional resources would be brought in the following morning. For the families, there was a little comfort in that explanation. Every hour without answers increased the fear that time was running out. The next morning, Tuesday, February 14, 2017, search efforts resumed almost immediately. Fresh volunteers joined law enforcement officers as they returned to the trail system surrounding Deer Creek. The objective remained straightforward: find Abby and Libby. Searchers carefully worked through areas that had been difficult to examine the previous night. Not long into the renewed effort, that hope came to an abrupt and devastating end. The bodies of Abigail Williams and Liberty German were discovered on private property near Deer Creek, not far from the Monon High Bridge trail. The news spread through Delphi with astonishing speed. Within moments, the community's greatest fear had become reality. The missing persons search had become a homicide investigation. For many residents, the transition was almost impossible to comprehend. Just one day earlier, 2 local girls had been enjoying an afternoon outdoors. Now, investigators were securing a crime scene in one of the quietest communities in Indiana. Law enforcement immediately began preserving evidence. The area surrounding the discovery became heavily restricted as investigators documented the scene, collected physical evidence, and worked to determine exactly what had happened. Officials were understandably cautious about releasing details. From the very beginning, investigators emphasized that protecting the integrity of the investigation required withholding certain information from the public. That approach would remain a defining feature of the Delphi case for years. While investigators processed the crime scene, news organizations began arriving in Delphi. Satellite trucks lined nearby roads. National media outlets started reporting on the murders. What had begun as a local missing persons case was rapidly becoming a story followed across the United States. As investigators pieced together the timeline, one crucial fact emerged. Libby German had done something extraordinary during the final moments before the attack. Unknown to whoever approached them that afternoon, she had used her cell phone to capture evidence. Initially, the public knew almost nothing about what that evidence contained. Investigators confirmed only that Libby's phone had provided information considered extremely important to the case. They urged anyone who had been near the trails that afternoon to come forward, no matter how insignificant their observations might seem. In the days that followed, law enforcement released a still image extracted from a video found on Libby's cell phone. The image showed a man walking across the Monon High Bridge. He appeared to be wearing blue jeans, a blue jacket, and a cap or hood. His hands were in his pockets as he walked toward the girls. Almost immediately, he became known around the world by a name that would forever be associated with this case: Bridge Guy. The photograph wasn't particularly sharp. His face was partially obscured. The quality left room for interpretation. Yet investigators were unequivocal in their message. They believed the man shown in the image was connected to the murders. That single frame transformed the investigation. Suddenly, millions of people weren't just following a tragic story. They were studying a face. People enlarged the image, adjusted contrast, debated clothing, posture, facial features, age, height, and build. Some believed they recognized him instantly. Others thought the image was too indistinct to identify anyone with confidence. Thousands of tips poured into law enforcement. Friends suspected neighbors. Co-workers questioned co-workers. Families quietly wondered whether someone they knew resembled the man on the bridge. The investigation had entered an entirely new phase. Then investigators revealed something even more startling. Libby's cell phone hadn't captured only an image. It had also recorded audio. When authorities released a brief clip to the public, the recording lasted only a few words. A male voice calmly instructed the girls, "Down the hill." There was nothing shouted, nothing frantic, no obvious rage. The ordinary tone of those words made them all the more chilling. The recording instantly became one of the most recognizable pieces of evidence in any American criminal investigation. People replayed it repeatedly, hoping familiarity might lead to recognition. Voice experts examined it. The public analyzed every syllable. Investigators hoped someone, somewhere, would hear those words and immediately know who had spoken them. The existence of both the video and the audio fundamentally changed public perception of the case. This wasn't simply an investigation built on witness recollections or circumstantial observations. Somewhere on Libby's cell phone was direct evidence recorded in real time. Evidence created not by investigators, but by one of the victims herself. It was an extraordinary act of awareness under circumstances no teenager should ever have faced. Yet, despite possessing evidence unlike almost any other homicide investigation, authorities still faced an enormous challenge. The image showed only part of the suspect. The audio consisted of only a few words. Neither piece of evidence by itself revealed the man's identity. As investigators appealed for more information, one question echoed throughout Delphi and far beyond its city limits. How could someone appear on camera, have his voice recorded, and still seemingly disappear without a trace? The discovery of Abigail Williams and Libby German marked the end of the search, but it was only the beginning of an investigation that would consume law enforcement, dominate national headlines, and leave an entire community searching for answers. In the days immediately following the murders, investigators worked around the clock to reconstruct every moment of February 13, 2017. Every known movement of Abby and Libby was carefully documented. Every witness who had visited the Monon High Bridge trail that afternoon was interviewed. Every vehicle reportedly seen near the trailhead became a potential lead. Investigators also began the painstaking process of examining physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. While officials repeatedly confirmed that they possessed evidence they believed would be valuable to the investigation, they deliberately chose not to disclose much of it publicly. For many observers, that level of secrecy became frustrating. People naturally wanted to know how the girls had died, what evidence had been recovered, and whether investigators believed the attack had been planned or opportunistic. But law enforcement consistently maintained that withholding key details was necessary to protect the integrity of the case. Their reasoning was straightforward. Information known only to the killer could later be used to verify confessions, evaluate suspects, and distinguish genuine tips from false ones. That investigative strategy became one of the defining characteristics of the Delphi case. It also fueled endless speculation. As news coverage expanded, amateur investigators, true crime communities, and social media users began examining every publicly available detail. Online forums filled with theories about the crime scene, the suspect's identity, possible motives, and whether the killer was local or had traveled to Delphi that day. Some theories were based on publicly confirmed facts. Many others were not. Investigators repeatedly urged the public to avoid treating rumors as evidence. They reminded people that speculation could complicate an active investigation and potentially harm innocent individuals. Even so, the extraordinary level of public interest proved impossible to slow. Within days, thousands of tips had begun arriving. Law enforcement established dedicated tip lines and encouraged anyone who had been in or around the Monon High Bridge Trail area on February 13th to come forward, even if they believed their information was insignificant. One recurring message from investigators stood out. No detail was too small. Perhaps someone had noticed a vehicle parked where it shouldn't have been. Perhaps someone had passed a person on the trail without realizing the encounter would later become important. Perhaps someone recognized the clothing, the posture, or the voice captured on Libby's cell phone. Investigators believed that solving the case might ultimately depend on one observation that initially seemed meaningless. The volume of information they received reflected just how deeply the murders had affected people. Thousands of tips required review. Each one had to be documented, assessed, and either pursued or eliminated. That process demanded an extraordinary commitment of time and resources from investigators representing multiple agencies. The Delphi investigation quickly became a collaborative effort involving local law enforcement, the Indiana State Police, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and numerous other partners. The scale of the investigation continued to grow. Specialists analyzed digital evidence. Forensic experts examined physical evidence collected from the crime scene. Investigators revisited witness statements repeatedly, searching for inconsistencies or overlooked details. Meanwhile, the public remained focused on two pieces of evidence that had become inseparable from the case: the image of the man on the bridge and the words, "Down the hill." The photograph and audio recording represented something unusual in a homicide investigation. The suspect had, in effect, been seen and heard by millions of people. Yet recognition never came in the way investigators had hoped. People across the country believed they recognized the man. Countless names were submitted. Some tips appeared promising at first. Others were quickly ruled out. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the central mystery remained unchanged. Who was the man on the bridge? The uncertainty affected more than just investigators. For the people of Delphi, everyday life had changed. Parents who once allowed children to spend afternoons exploring local parks became more cautious. Neighbors who had rarely locked their doors began doing so. A place that had long symbolized quiet recreation became permanently associated with tragedy. The Monon High Bridge itself took on an entirely different meaning. Before February 2017, it had been known primarily as a historic landmark. After the murders, it became a symbol recognized around the world. Visitors continued coming to Delphi, but many arrived not to enjoy the scenery, but to understand the setting where one of America's most haunting criminal cases had unfolded. For Abby and Libby's families, public attention brought both hope and hardship. Every news report kept the case in the public eye, increasing the likelihood that someone might come forward with crucial information. At the same time, every anniversary, every television special, and every online discussion reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Through it all, family members continued speaking about the girls themselves rather than allowing them to be remembered only as victims. They described Abby's quiet kindness, her creativity, her thoughtful nature. They remembered Libby's adventurous personality, her curiosity, her love of photography, and the confidence that often inspired those around her. Those memories mattered because they reminded the public of something that can easily become lost in high-profile investigations. Before there was a mystery, before there was a suspect, before there was a photograph viewed around the world, there were simply two friends enjoying an unexpected day off from school. That perspective is essential when looking back at February 13, 2017. The story did not begin as a criminal investigation. It began with ordinary moments: a sleepover, a ride to a trail, a photograph shared between friends, plans to be picked up a couple of hours later. Those simple events make the tragedy feel especially personal because they are so familiar. Almost anyone can imagine making the same plans with family or friends. Almost anyone can picture themselves believing they would be home before dinner. Perhaps that is one reason the Delphi murders continue to resonate nearly a decade later. The case challenged assumptions about safety in small communities. It demonstrated how quickly ordinary routines can be shattered, and it highlighted the remarkable presence of mind Libby displayed by recording evidence that investigators believed would become critical to identifying the person who confronted them. Although that evidence did not immediately solve the case, it ensured that investigators and the public would never stop searching for the man seen walking across the Monon High Bridge. As time passed, the investigation remained active. Authorities consistently emphasized that the case had not been forgotten. They continued reviewing evidence, evaluating tips, and encouraging anyone with information to come forward. For those following the case, patience became one of the hardest realities to accept. Days became months. Months became years. The questions remained. Who was Bridge Guy? What happened during those final moments on the trail? And what crucial piece of information was still missing? Those questions would define the Delphi investigation for years, ensuring that February 13, 2017, would never be remembered as just another winter afternoon in Indiana. Instead, it became the day two best friends left home for a walk across an abandoned railroad bridge and never returned. It became a case that united investigators from multiple agencies, drew worldwide attention, and reminded millions of people how fragile ordinary moments can be. And while the investigation would continue beyond the point where this chapter ends, the events of that single afternoon remain the foundation of everything that followed. Because before there were arrests, courtroom arguments, or legal proceedings, there were Abby Williams and Libby German. Two young friends, one familiar trail, one ordinary afternoon, and one tragedy that would forever change the town of Delphi. If you found this documentary informative and thoughtfully presented, please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps bring carefully researched true crime stories to more viewers while honoring the victims through accurate and responsible storytelling. If you have thoughts on this case, or remember how you first learned about the Delphi murders, share them respectfully in the comments below.